Ask yourself this: when your income doubles, actually doubles, from what you make now to twice what you make now, what changes about you? Not what you buy, what actually changes inside you? Most people ask that describe an object, a car, a house, a vacation. The purchase list expands. That is the surface answer, and it is not wrong, but it is not the answer. The real answer is that your income does not just change what you can afford, it changes what you can perceive. Each altitude of income is a specific atmospheric pressure. You see differently at each one. Your nervous system rewires under it. In the person you are at 22,000 a year, in the person you are at 300, in the person you are at 1.2 million, are functionally three different people occupying the same body across time. Take yourself, follow the arc from the bottom to somewhere near the top. Watch what happens at each altitude, not to your spending, to your interior. This is not a video about money. It is a video about who you become on the way through. 6 altitudes, 1 life, 1 nervous system underneath. You are 23. You earn 22,000 and change a year. Take home is roughly 17. Rent is $11.50 a month, which means 14,000 a year of that 17,000 is already accounted for before you buy a single meal. At this altitude, money is not a resource, it is a diminishing timer. Every discretionary decision, the coffee, the dentist, the friend's birthday dinner you want to attend, the tire that failed on a Wednesday, is measured against rent day. Your nervous system operates in a permanent low-grade tachycardia. There is a specific insomnia that lives at this altitude. It shows up at 3 in the morning. It is the arithmetic that will not close. You lie there and you run the numbers, and the numbers stay hostile. And eventually you fall asleep somewhere around 4:30, and the alarm goes off at 6. The most under-discussed feature of this altitude is what it does to your dignity. Not that it strips it, that framing is too dramatic. What actually happens is subtler and worse. You learn unconsciously to shrink your own preferences before you articulate them. You default to the cheaper option in the menu before you read the pricier one. You reject invitations you want to accept, and you pretend to reject them for a different reason. You're tired, you're busy, you have a thing on Saturday. You become fluent in a specific dialect of graceful decline. That dialect is a language. It has grammar and vocabulary and idiom. It is spoken all over the country every day by tens of millions of people, and it is invisible to anyone who has never had to learn it. There is a specific decision fatigue that lives here as well.
Slightly less necessary.
You're not choosing between good and better. You're choosing between necessary and slightly less necessary, all day, every day, for years. The frontal cortex was not built for that volume of small trade-offs. By 7 in the evening, you cannot decide what to eat, not because you lack options, but because your executive function ran out of budget somewhere around 3. This is not laziness, this is a scarce cognitive resource, priced correctly, and the price is being paid all day by a person operating without a buffer. Research from the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which tracks anonymized cash flows across roughly 6 million households, shows that at this income level, consumption tracks paycheck timing almost 1-for-1. That is not budgeting, that is the absence of buffer. That is what running on the exact edge feels like from the inside. This isn't theory, it's arithmetic. Your home is roughly 60. Rent went up to $1,500, but you moved to a slightly better apartment and you can afford it. You even have a couch you actually picked out instead of the one your last roommate left behind. At this altitude, the acute panic recedes. This is the first real upgrade. You sleep better. The 3 in the morning arithmetic stops firing. There is a buffer in your checking account on the day before payday. Not much, maybe $600, but it is a positive number. That alone is a psychological revolution you did not fully anticipate. For the first year, you notice the buffer with something close to gratitude. Then, in the second year, the second order feeling arrives. It is not what you expected, it is ordinariness. At this altitude, you have enough. You have crossed into the middle class by every standard federal measure, and you notice for the first time cleanly that the middle class is where you go to be forgotten. It is not a landing pad, it is a plateau. And from this plateau, you can see 2 things you could not see from below. You can see for the first time what is above you, not vaguely, specifically. Your coworker who inherited an apartment in a neighborhood you cannot afford. The high school friend who took a startup role and has, on paper, a number you cannot quite verify but suspect is somewhere north of 1 million. A neighbor who casually mentions a second home in a way that tells you it is his fourth. You can see them because you are close enough to the door to feel the temperature of the room on the other side. And you can see for the first time what you used to be, which is a specific kind of grief that people at this altitude do not want to talk about. Because if you talk about it, you sound ungrateful. You are not ungrateful. You are just now aware of the size of the spread between no longer terrified and actually free. That spread is enormous. It is bigger than the one you just closed to get here. That is the second altitude. It is where you get the honest answer to the question, does money make you happy? And the honest answer is, it removes a specific kind of suffering and reveals a different suffering you did not know was going to be there. A specific version of this second suffering has been documented by researchers who study subjective well-being. The relief that comes from crossing out of scarcity is real and large. The relief that comes from crossing further into the 80,000 band and beyond is much smaller, and the smallness is itself part of what disorients you. You had assumed the number was the thing. It turns out the number was the on-ramp, and now that you are on the road has a different problem. The road has direction, and you have to decide which one to point yourself in. Brief stop. Before we go up another altitude, that is where the interior really starts to shift. If the way this is unfolding is landing the way I think it is, the subscribe button is right there. Net sum keeps counting when the levels get quieter. That is the direction. You are 36. You earn $240,000 a year. Bonus brings it to 280. Take home is roughly 170 after all the deductions and the retirement match. At 240,000 a year, and this is a genuine surprise, you stop hearing money. For most of your life, you experienced money as noise. It was in every decision. What could you afford? What could you not? When was rent due? Would the car need replacing? Could you take the vacation? Could you pay the tax bill on time? At this altitude, for the first time, you stop hearing it. That does not mean the questions disappear, it means you handle them at a lower volume. Rent, food, transportation, the tax bill, the retirement contribution, all of these get handled without conscious thought. There is enough. Not enough to be careless, enough to make careful decisions from a resting state nervous system instead of a fight or flight one. What you notice next is that you do not know what to want. At the previous altitudes, wanting was easy. Wanting was the tire that could be replaced without going into debt. Wanting was the vacation that would not push you into overdraft. Wanting was the apartment with a working washing machine. At this altitude, those wants are all met, and you are faced with the question that every altitude past the middle class hands you, sooner or later. What actually would you do with the life you were not defending? Compare it to where you were a year ago. A year ago, the question of want was answered for you by the shape of what was still missing. Now, nothing is missing in the survival sense, and the question comes back louder, because there is finally room in your head for it. This is the disappointment nobody warned you about. You had assumed at earlier altitudes that the six-figure salary was the finish line. It is not the finish line. It is a doorway. And the room on the other side has more doors, and the doors do not have labels. You are 42. You earn $620,000 a year. Between salary, bonus, and equity vesting, aggregate compensation is closer to $900,000. At $600,000 a year, the vocabulary of your interior life changes. You stop feeling money and start seeing it as a spreadsheet. You pay a CPA $3,800 a year to think about your tax picture. You have an entity structure. You have a Roth ladder. You have a taxable brokerage that you fund automatically. You do not think about the cost of the coffee. You do not think about the cost of the meal. You think about the annualized after-tax return on the equity vesting schedule. Research from Rod Chetty and the Opportunity Insights team at Harvard has documented the intergenerational mobility patterns of the American income distribution for years. What their data shows, if you sit with it, is that the psychological spread between the 90th percentile and the 50th is not simply a bigger version of the spread between the 50th and the 10th. It is a different kind of spread. It is dimensional. It is not that people at $600,000 a year have more of what people at $80,000 have. It is that they have entered a different category of concern entirely. At this altitude, the friend circle rotates for the second time, not because you wanted it to, because the language changed. When you describe a work problem, the friends from your 22,000 life do not know what to say, not because they are less smart, because the problem is now a problem of structure, not of survival. So you stop describing those problems to them, and they stop asking, and the friendship becomes a friendship of shared history, not shared present. That is a specific kind of loss, and it does not have a common word for it yet. You start noticing a pattern in your own decisions that would have been invisible 5 years earlier. Every choice you make now has a structural component and an emotional component, and the structural one wins by default, because the structural one is where the money is. This is not a moral failure. This is what an income of 600,000 does to your default mode of thinking. It is the habit that got you here. You are 49. Aggregate compensation is 1.2 million a year across salary, bonus, and vested equity. The line between salary and wealth has blurred at this altitude. Most of what you take home now is a form of asset accumulation, not a form of consumption fuel. At 1.2 million a year and above, you no longer experience money as money. What arrives in your wealth manager report on the 7th of each month is an abstraction. You do not see it directly. You see allocation, you see percentages, you see the after-tax internal rate of return on the direct indexing strategy your wealth manager set up 2 years ago. Money is no longer what your nervous system tracks. Time is. Time is the scarce resource, and time is in the allowable actor list of every serious financial framework, because time is, in fact, what everything above this altitude is measured in. You do not think about your checking account. You do not think about your rent because you own 3 properties outright. You do not think about your groceries because they arrive on Wednesdays without you ordering them. What you think about is calendar. Whose call to take, whose to send to an assistant, whose meeting to skip, whose invitation to accept, whose to decline. Your calendar is your true financial statement now. And here's what nobody prepares you for. At 1.2 million a year, you are more isolated than you were at 22,000. It is a different isolation. At 22,000, you were isolated by shame and by the specific fatigue of always running on empty. At 1.2 million, you are isolated by comprehension. The number of people in your life who understand your actual day is small. It is measurable. It is somewhere between 4 and 8. The people from your 22,000 life are still in your life. You call your mother on Sundays. You see your college friends twice a year. You love them the same way you loved them at 22. But you cannot describe your Tuesday to them. Not because you do not want to, because the vocabulary does not translate, and the effort to translate is exhausting for both parties. So you stop trying, and they stop trying. And the shape of the friendship shifts to something narrower and quieter and, in a way you do not enjoy naming, a little bit sadder. The final observation, and this is the hardest one, is that at the top of this arc, you cannot go back. There is no return. The people you were at 22, at 80, at 240, at 600, those people are gone. You build the person who could hold the altitude you are at now. And the person who could hold it is not the same person who started the climb. There is a version of freedom at 1.2 million a year. It is real. It is not a lie. You have more agency over your hours than almost anyone in human history has ever had. You can spend a Tuesday afternoon reading a book. You can visit your mother without calculating whether the flight is affordable. You can pay for surgeries your family cannot afford. All of this is true, and all of it is worth what you paid for it. What you paid for it is the person you used to be. And that is a specific loss. It is not spoken about at the Wealth Manager quarterly review. It is not photographed. It does not show up on any report, but it is real. It is the stillness at the top of the arc. It is what money buys and what money costs in the same currency. There is one more thing worth naming, and it is the piece that surprises people at every altitude when it lands. The person who counted the dollars at 23 and the person who watches allocations at 49 are connected by a single thread. The habit that got you through each altitude was the same habit. The specific form changed, the underlying discipline did not. You built one thing over decades and it carried you the whole way through. That is the sum. That is what altitudes actually stack. Ask yourself the question again. When your income doubles, what changes about you? Not the things you buy, what changes about you? Now you know, every altitude has an answer. Every altitude has a cost. Every altitude has a specific version of you it produces. The salary is not the sum, the person is.